The last thing I expected when I opened my door to hand over my rent that evening was to end up pressed gently against the hallway wall, my landlord's breath warm against my neck as he whispered that he had tried to stay professional but couldn't keep pretending anymore. He had only come to collect the monthly payment. Yet, the way his fingers brushed mine when I handed him the envelope sent a current through both of us, and before I could step back, he reached out and touched my shoulder like he'd done it 1,000 times in his head. In that split second, I remembered every small encounter we'd had since the day I signed the lease. Every careful smile, every accidental touch, every long look that lasted a little too long, and somehow I knew this was the moment all of it had been leading to. The hallway was quiet, the evening sun bleeding through the small window near the stairs, and with my heart pounding against my ribs, I realized I didn't want him to step back or apologize. I wanted him to stay exactly where he was. It all began 4 months earlier, when I moved into a small brick house on a quiet street. The kind of neighborhood where people still wave when they pass each other on morning walks. The owner, Mark, lived directly across the street in a slightly bigger house with a blue front door, and from the first moment I met him to sign the contract, I felt a strange pull I couldn't put into words. He was calm and polite, explaining every part of the lease with this quiet patience that made it impossible not to trust him. And when our hands brushed as we exchanged papers, I felt something like a spark, even though we both pretended not to notice. As the days went by, I saw him more often than I expected, sometimes trimming the hedges in front of his house, sometimes checking the mailbox late in the evening, and every time our eyes met across the street, there was a pause, a small moment that felt heavier than a simple greeting. At first, the meetings were casual and practical, like when he stopped by to replace a flickering kitchen light or when I asked him to take a look at the loose tile near the back door. He always kept a respectful distance, but his eyes stayed on mine longer than necessary, and I noticed how his voice softened when he asked if everything was working properly. One afternoon, while fixing a cabinet hinge, he leaned closer than usual, and for a breath of a second, our shoulders touched. Neither of us moved away, and when he finally stepped back, he cleared his throat and said he would come back later to finish, even though he had already tightened the last screw. I spent the rest of that evening replaying that small touch, wondering if I had imagined the warmth in his eyes or the way his lips parted slightly when he looked down at me, but nothing compared to the first day of the month, when he always stopped by to collect the rent in person. He could have sent a message or asked me to drop the envelope in his mailbox, but he never did. Instead, he would appear at my door right after sunset, always with a polite smile and a quiet, "Hope everything's going well," but the way he said it made it sound like more than just a polite greeting. Every first of the month became our small ritual, the brief moment when my fingers touched his as I handed him the envelope, and each time it happened, I felt like the space between us grew smaller and smaller, though neither of us talked about it. Still, the tension stayed unspoken until that evening, when he came by for the rent and found me standing barefoot in the doorway, still warm from a shower, my hair damp and the air between us thick with something neither of us tried to hide anymore. When I pressed the envelope into his hand, his thumb brushed over my wrist and lingered there, and instead of stepping back like he usually did, he stayed in the doorway, his eyes searching mine, as if waiting for permission he didn't need to ask for. For a moment, neither of us moved, and then he stepped forward, closing the door softly behind him, his voice barely above a whisper as he said my name like he'd been practicing it for weeks. Standing there in the quiet hallway, with the soft light spilling across the floor and his hand still gently touching my wrist, I realized we were both done pretending our meetings were just about rent or repairs. The silence that followed should have been awkward, but it wasn't. It felt like the charged pause right before thunder, when the air is too full to stay still any longer. Mark's eyes didn't leave mine for even a second, and although his hand had already dropped from my wrist, I could still feel the warmth traveling up my arm like an echo that refused to fade. He inhaled deeply, as if steadying himself, then admitted quietly, "Honestly, that every time he'd cross the street for rent or repairs, he had told himself it was just business, even though it never felt that way. I opened my mouth to answer, but he shook his head softly, stepped closer, and said he needed to finish his sentence before he lost the courage to say it out loud. He told me he had tried to ignore the way his heart picked up whenever I waved from the porch, or how he kept finding excuses to walk past my window, hoping to catch even a glimpse of me cooking, reading, living. He said he had planned to simply take the envelope and leave, like every month before. But the moment he saw me standing barefoot in the soft hallway light, he knew he couldn't keep pretending we were just landlord and tenant. The honesty in his voice hit so hard I almost forgot to breathe, and before I could say anything back, he broke eye contact for the first time and stepped back, mumbling that he was sorry and he should go. It was that small step away more than the words that made something in me snap, and without even thinking, I reached out and took his hand before he turned toward the door. He froze the second my fingers wrapped around his, and when he looked back at me, there was something raw in his expression, like he was balancing between hope and fear. I didn't give him time to pull away. I stepped closer and told him that I had felt the same thing from the very first moment we'd signed the lease, that I had stopped thinking of him as just the owner of the house a long time ago. For a moment, he just stared at me like he was trying to make sure this was real, and then his hand tightened around mine, his thumb brushing slowly over the back of my palm in a way that made my whole body heat up. Neither of us spoke, but we started moving almost in sync, stepping slowly backward toward the living room, like we didn't dare break eye contact in case the spell dissolved. Halfway across the room, he stopped and lifted his free hand to cup my cheek, his fingers trembling slightly, but when I leaned into his touch, his breathing steadied. He leaned in slowly, giving me every chance to pull away, and when I didn't, his lips brushed mine in the softest, most careful kiss I've ever known, like he was trying to memorize the exact moment everything changed. The second our mouths touched, something in both of us gave in completely. His other hand slid around my waist and pulled me against him, while I brought my arms up around his neck, and the kiss deepened with a quiet urgency neither of us tried to control. It wasn't rushed, but it wasn't gentle either. It was full of all the weeks of wanting and holding back, and with every slow pull of his lips against mine, I felt the rest of the world fall away until there was nothing but the sound of our breathing and the steady beat of his heart against my chest. He pulled back for a moment, resting his forehead against mine, and whispered that if I wanted him to stop, I just had to say the word. But instead of answering, I pressed my lips to his again, letting him know without words that I wanted all of it. As we kissed again, even deeper this time, I felt his fingers slide softly beneath the hem of my shirt, tracing the skin at my lower back with a tenderness that made me shiver, and I mirrored the gesture by slipping my hand beneath his jacket, feeling the warm muscles along his side. Every little touch felt like a spark, every gentle stroke carrying the promise of something bigger, and when he whispered my name against my lips, I felt a wave of emotion so strong it almost knocked me off balance. Just then, a sudden knock rattled against the front door, sharp and unexpected, slicing through the moment like a blade and making both of us freeze in place, lips still almost touching, a breath caught in our throats. We pulled back, eyes wide, both of us staring toward the door as if it might swing open any second, and in that heartbeat of surprise, I realized neither of us had any idea who could be standing there or what they might see if they walked inside. For a full second, neither of us moved, as if the knock might disappear if we just stayed perfectly still. Mark's hand was still resting at my waist, and my fingers were still curled into the collar of his jacket, but the warm glow between us shifted into a nervous heat that made my pulse hammer in my throat. The knock came again louder this time, and I saw something flicker across Mark's face, a quick flash of protective instinct like he was already trying to shield me from whatever might be waiting on the other side of the door. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he stepped back and whispered that I should stay where I was while he checked, but I shook my head and followed him toward the entryway, our shoulders moving almost in sync. When he opened the door, neither of us expected to see Mrs. Callahan, the elderly neighbor from 2 houses down, standing there with her hands wrapped tightly around a small wicker basket. She smiled warmly, saying she had baked too many apple muffins and wanted to drop some off just in case I hadn't eaten dinner yet. Before I could thank her, she looked over my shoulder and saw Mark standing behind me, still slightly breathless, his hair a little out of place, and her smile froze just enough for me to notice. She didn't say anything strange, but the way her eyes moved between the two of us made it clear she was already putting pieces together, her curious gaze lingering a moment too long on the hand Mark had resting lightly on the small of my back. We thanked her and accepted the basket, and after she finally left, closing the door with a small, knowing grin, we both released the breath we didn't realize we'd been holding. Mark laughed softly, shaking his head at how close we had come to being caught in something neither of us was ready to explain, and I felt a sudden wave of nervous excitement racing through me, like we had just crossed another invisible line together, without fully meaning to. He looked at me then, not with panic, but with this steady, calm intensity that said he wasn't going to pretend anymore, even if people started noticing. Slowly, he reached out and brushed a strand of hair away from my forehead, and the softness of that small gesture made my chest tighten in a completely different way. "Where were we?" he asked, his voice just above a whisper, and even though the question made me smile, there was something deeper behind it, something that asked if I was still willing to move forward despite the risk. Instead of answering with words, I stepped closer and slipped my fingers back into his, leading him quietly toward the living room again. This time, there was no hesitation, no nervous glance toward the door. He followed me willingly, closing the distance between us the moment we crossed the threshold. He cupped my face in both hands and kissed me again, slower and more deliberately than before, as if the interruption had only made the need stronger rather than breaking it. As our lips moved together, he slid one hand down to the small of my back, pulling me gently against him while his other hand skimmed along my jawline, his thumb tracing slow circles that sent heat pulsing through every inch of my body. I wrapped my arms around his neck and felt him exhale softly against my mouth, his heartbeat pressing steady and strong against my chest as we lost ourselves in the moment all over again. Every movement felt like the confirmation of something that had always existed between us, and by the time he whispered my name again, his voice low and slightly rough with emotion, I knew that nothing about this was casual or temporary. The kiss deepened with a slow, powerful tenderness, and when he finally broke away just enough to look me in the eyes, he asked quietly, sincerely, if I wanted him to stay for the rest of the evening. Before I could answer, my phone buzzed loudly on the coffee table with an incoming text, the screen lighting up with the name of someone neither of us expected at that moment. And when I saw the name flashing across the screen, my breath caught in my throat. It was Ryan, my ex. For a moment, I just stared at the name glowing on the screen, feeling the tension in the room twist into something sharper, like a sudden drop in temperature that made every inch of my skin tighten. Mark's hand was still resting at my waist, his body so close that I could feel the heat radiating off him, but the sight of that name pulled me backward into memories I hadn't planned on reliving tonight. I didn't move to pick up the phone right away, and Mark noticed his brows pulling together in quiet concern, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he gently slipped his fingers down to lace with mine, grounding me back in the present. The phone buzzed again, and this time, I saw the first few words of the message appear on the lock screen. "I know it's late, but I keep thinking about you." Mark's grip on my hand tightened ever so slightly, not possessive, just protective, like he could feel the shift in my breathing and wanted to steady it. "I can go, if you need to talk to him," he said softly, and even though the offer was calm, I could hear something underneath it, a quiet fear that this might be the moment our timing fell apart. I shook my head immediately, turning my phone face down on the table, and told him I didn't want Ryan back in any part of my life. Not tonight. Not ever again. Still, the interruption had cracked the moment open in a way neither of us expected, and suddenly we were standing there in the middle of the room with a whole new question hanging between us. Was this just about attraction? Or was this something strong enough to stand against the pull of the past? Mark stepped forward, placing his hand gently over my heart, and asked in a low, steady voice, "Are you sure you're ready for this? Or am I just catching you in a space where you feel lonely?" The honesty of the question hit harder than any kiss could have, and I felt my throat tighten as I realized how much he wasn't asking for reassurance. He was asking for truth, because he cared enough not to rush into something that might fall apart later. I took his hand and pressed it even closer to my chest so he could feel how fast my heart was beating, then told him that I had been ready for this long before tonight. I had just been too scared to admit it until now. Something in his eyes shifted then, softening with relief and pride, and before I could say anything else, he leaned in and kissed me again, not urgently, but with the kind of slow, confident certainty that told me he believed every word. Without breaking the kiss, he guided me gently backward until the backs of my knees touched the edge of the couch, and I sat down, pulling him with me so he settled beside me, bodies pressed close. His fingers traced along my jaw, down my throat, and across my shoulder, each touch deliberate and tender, and I mirrored him by letting my hands explore the shape of his arms, the warmth of his chest beneath the fabric of his shirt. He whispered my name again against my lips, a soft, reverent sound, and asked if I wanted him to stay the night, even if it meant facing whatever came next together in the morning. I nodded, unable to trust my voice for a second, and the way he smiled at that, eyes shining with something deeper than desire, made my entire body feel like it was being held gently from the inside. Just as he reached down to interlace our fingers and pull me fully into his embrace, a sudden sharp flash of headlights swept across the living room window, and a car slowed to a stop directly in front of the house. It was Ryan's car. The blast of headlights froze both of us in place, and for a heartbeat I couldn't hear anything except the pounding of my own pulse. Mark turned his head toward the window, his arm instinctively tightening around my shoulders, as if shielding me from something neither of us fully understood yet. I watched the car sitting there, engine idling, headlights spilling across the front of the house like a spotlight, and even before I saw the outline of a figure behind the steering wheel, I knew exactly who it was. Ryan wasn't just passing by. He had come here intentionally, and the timing could not have been worse. Mark didn't say anything, but when he looked back at me, his eyes were searching, trying to read whether I was about to get up and walk out that door or stay right where I was. I swallowed hard, every muscle in my body tense with the sudden pressure of the past colliding with the present, and for a second I felt that old familiar pull habit, guilt, unfinished words. But then Mark's thumb brushed gently over the back of my hand, quiet and grounding, and it reminded me exactly where I was and exactly who had chosen to be here with me tonight. I took a slow breath, shook my head, and whispered, "I'm not going out there." Almost as soon as I said it, the headlights flicked off and the car door slammed shut. Footsteps approached across the gravel walk, steady and deliberate, and a knock, sharp and impatient, struck the front door, echoing through the hallway like a challenge. Mark started to rise, but I stopped him, squeezing his hand and whispering that I would handle it. As I stood, I felt his fingers slip from mine, not in fear, but in trust, and that small act of faith gave me the strength I needed to walk toward the door and face what waited on the other side. When I opened it, Ryan stood in the doorway looking exactly the way I remembered, confident, composed, and slightly annoyed that I'd taken so long to respond. He didn't say hello, didn't apologize for showing up unannounced. Instead, he said he'd been thinking about us and wanted to talk, just for a minute. Before I could answer, he leaned to the side and glanced past me into the living room, and his eyes landed directly on Mark, who was standing just behind the couch, arms crossed calmly, expression unreadable but unmistakably protective. Ryan's mouth tightened, and the silence between all three of us grew heavy enough to bend the air. "I see you've moved on," Ryan said flatly, his tone dripping with something between disappointment and accusation. I didn't step aside. I didn't invite him in. Instead, I told him that whatever he thought we still had was over and had been over for a long time, and that showing up this late, hoping to rewind the past, wasn't fair to either of us. For a moment, he just stood there, stunned, as if he'd never expected me to say the words out loud. And when he finally looked at Mark again, it wasn't anger in his eyes, but something like surprise, maybe even respect. Ryan exhaled sharply, muttered that he just needed to see it with his own eyes, then stepped back and headed toward his car without another word. I watched him drive away, the red taillights fading into the dark, and when I closed the door behind me, the house felt different, lighter, safer, like something heavy had finally been lifted. Mark was waiting in the hallway when I turned around, and before I could speak, he stepped forward and pulled me into a quiet, warm embrace. He didn't ask what had been said. He didn't need to. He just held me close, one hand gently rubbing the middle of my back while the other settled against my neck, in a silent promise that I wasn't alone anymore. When I finally pulled back and looked up at him, I whispered, "I want you to stay." And this time, there was no hesitation in my voice. The door clicked shut behind me, and for the first time since the evening began, I felt a deep, steady calm settle over everything, as if the house itself had exhaled. Mark remained close, his fingers still resting gently against the back of my neck as if he didn't want to let me drift even an inch away. And I realized how different his touch felt from anything I'd known before. It wasn't just warm, it was sure. We stood there in the hallway for a long moment without saying anything, letting the quiet wrap around us like a blanket. And when I finally met his eyes, something inside me softened completely. He smiled a small, real smile that I had only ever seen in rare flashes, and brushed his thumb along my cheekbone in a gesture so tender it made my knees feel unsteady. "Come here," I whispered, and took his hand, leading him back into the living room where the air still held the faint scent of apple muffins and the memory of our unfinished kiss. We sat side by side on the couch, knees touching, our fingers still intertwined, and as I looked at him in the warm glow of the lamp, I felt every wall I'd built over the years finally begin to fall away. There was no more past pressing at the door, no more hesitant what-ifs lingering between us, only the quiet promise of something new and real that belonged entirely to the two of us. Mark turned slightly toward me, resting his arm along the back of the couch, and asked if I was truly okay, and the seriousness in his voice made my chest tighten in the best possible way. I nodded and told him that I hadn't just closed a door with Ryan tonight. I had opened one with him, and it felt like the first honest step I'd taken in a very long time. He reached up and brushed a strand of hair away from my forehead, then leaned in and kissed me again. Slowly and gently, the kind of kiss that wasn't rushed by uncertainty, but grounded in quiet gratitude and the sweet relief of finally being seen. As we melted into the moment, his hand slid to my waist, tracing a slow, warm line along my side, and I rested my palm on his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath my fingertips. He whispered that he wanted to stay not just for the night, but for whatever came next, and the certainty in his voice made something bloom deep inside my chest. We stayed on the couch for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, occasionally talking in low voices about everything we had held back for weeks, the little glances, the silent hopes, the way each of us had secretly looked forward to the first of every month. At one point, he laughed softly and admitted that he'd replaced the perfectly working porch light last week just to have an excuse to come over, and I laughed with him, realizing I'd spent an entire afternoon pretending the kitchen faucet was leaking just so I could hear his footsteps on the porch. Every shared confession made the space between us warmer and lighter, until our shoulders were pressed together and our fingers laced so tightly. It felt like we were holding on to more than just each other. We were holding on to the start of something we no longer had any reason to hide from. Eventually, he pulled a blanket over us and shifted so I could rest my head on his shoulder, his arm wrapped securely around me, and in the stillness of the room, I let my eyes drift closed, safe in the knowledge that he wasn't going anywhere. Just before sleep pulled me under, I heard him whisper, barely above a breath, "I've wanted this from the moment you signed that contract," and with a quiet smile, I whispered back, "Me too." The morning sunlight filtered through the curtains in soft golden bands, and for a moment I wasn't sure where I was until I felt the gentle weight of Mark's arm draped over my waist. I stayed perfectly still, not wanting to break the fragile peace of that early hour, and let myself sink into the warmth of his body pressed behind me, his steady breathing brushing softly against the back of my neck. It felt strange and beautiful to wake up not in a hurried rush to start the day, but in a quiet cocoon of safety and closeness, knowing that what had happened last night wasn't a dream or a moment we'd pretend never happened. I turned slowly to face him, and when his eyes opened, still heavy with sleep but full of something soft and sure, he smiled in a way that made my chest ache with the simple honesty of it. "Good morning," he murmured, his voice rough and low, and the way he said it made the simple words feel like the start of something brand new. I smiled back and brushed my thumb across his cheekbone, and he caught my hand gently, pressing a slow kiss to my fingers, as if even that small touch deserved to be held carefully. Neither of us rushed to get up. Instead, we stayed wrapped in each other for a while, trading quiet words and small touches, letting the world outside remain distant and unimportant. Eventually, though, he tilted his head and asked if I'd let him make breakfast, and there was something so endearing in his tone, half playful, half shy, that I said yes before he even finished the question. He moved around my kitchen like he already belonged there, confident, comfortable, and relaxed as he started making coffee and pulling pans from the cabinet. I leaned against the counter, watching him work, and it struck me how natural this felt, how easily we moved around each other without hesitation, like we had slipped into a rhythm we didn't even know we'd been practicing. Between chopping vegetables and scrambling eggs, he would pause to steal a kiss or brush his fingers along my waist as he reached past me for a mug, each small contact so casual and intimate that my heart kept fluttering with quiet happiness. At one point, I reached up to wipe a smear of sauce from his cheek, and he caught my wrist gently, looking at me with a softness I'd never seen from him before, then leaned down and kissed me so slowly and sweetly that I forgot completely about the pan on the stove. We ate together at the small kitchen table, our knees touching, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was waiting for the next problem to appear. Instead, we talked about simple things, how he had always loved the light in my front windows around sunset, how I'd noticed the way he always lingered by the gate even after saying goodbye, and each shared memory built another quiet brick in the foundation of something real. When we finished eating, he cleared the plates and washed them without me asking, humming softly under his breath while I leaned in the doorway, memorizing the sight of him standing there like he'd always belonged. And when he finally dried his hands and turned toward me, all I could do was step forward and wrap my arms around him, feeling the steady beat of his heart against mine as he held me close. "I don't want this to be just one night," I said quietly into his shoulder, and he pulled back just enough to look me in the eyes, his expression full of calm certainty. "It won't be," he said, brushing his hand through my hair. "This is just the beginning." Later that afternoon, once the plates were put away and the last traces of breakfast had faded from the air, we stepped out onto the front porch and stood for a moment beneath the soft light, side by side, just looking across the street to his house, the place where all of this had quietly begun long before either of us admitted it. For a second we didn't say anything, letting the stillness wrap around us like a pause in an unfinished sentence, and I felt the weight of everything we had gone through settle into something calm and steady. Mark slipped his hand into mine, his thumb brushing gentle circles against my skin, and said he had never imagined that walking across this small street with a rent envelope could lead to something that felt this important. I smiled, squeezing his hand back, and told him I used to think those quiet monthly visits were just routine until I realized I was spending entire days looking forward to the sound of his footsteps on my porch. We didn't need big promises or dramatic declarations. The comfort of standing there together, out in the open where anyone could see, carried more meaning than any words could have expressed. As we stood in the sunlight, Mrs. Callahan passed by on her afternoon walk, pausing just long enough to give us a knowing smile and a cheerful wave before continuing down the street without a single hint of surprise. We both laughed softly at that, and Mark leaned down to press a gentle kiss to my temple, not hurried or hidden, just honest and natural, like it had always belonged there. In that moment, I realized that all the quiet tension, the stolen moments, and the hesitation had led us here not to something risky or fragile, but to something solid and earned. Eventually, Mark turned to me and asked if I wanted to come over later that evening for dinner. He said he had been waiting for the right reason to finally open the bottle of wine he'd been saving since last year, and now he knew exactly who he wanted to share it with. I said yes without a second of hesitation, and the look he gave me in response made my heart swell with the kind of warmth that doesn't burn out. We stood there a little longer, just enjoying the view of our quiet street together, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the kind of peace that comes when you finally step into the story you were meant to be living. As he headed home to prepare for the evening, he paused halfway across the street, turned back, and called out my name with that soft, familiar smile. "I'll be back for you," he said, not in a rush, not as a warning, but as a promise. And as I watched him walk back toward his blue front door, I knew that the next time he crossed that street, he wouldn't be coming to collect rent. He would be coming home.